Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world that's weirder than your uncle's Facebook feed and twice as over-engineered. The world of Victorian inventions so bizarre you'd swear everyone was surviving on a diet of gin fumes and experimental medicine. This was a time when someone looked at a horse and thought, what if we gave it roller skates? Or stared at a coffin and said, needs more cup holders. So, before you get cozy, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me which completely useless contraption you'd have patented if you were alive in 1873. Now, dim those lights, turn on your fan for that gentle white noise, and snuggle in with your softest pillow. Maybe hide your phone so you're not tempted to Google Victorian dog powdering machines at 2 a.m. But let's pause for a moment. Were Victorians genuinely trying to solve problems, or just inventing new ways to confuse their grandchildren? Why did half their ideas involve strapping knives to farm animals? Who needed a spring-loaded baby walker powered by live pigeons? Could you survive a day in a world where every gadget is part weapon, part furniture, and part lawsuit? Or would you proudly spend your wages on a portable beard-washing station with built-in gravy dispenser? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1867. The air smells faintly of coal dust, overcooked cabbage, and unearned confidence. You're wearing 6 layers of itchy wool, you have no idea what half the machinery in your bedroom is supposed to do, and your neighbour is inviting you over to test his new steam-powered eyebrow curler. Welcome to the world's strangest laboratory, otherwise known as Victorian life. Let's talk about mornings. In the Victorian era, the day didn't begin with a gentle iPhone trill, but with the violent launch of a spring-loaded alarm bed. Imagine being flung upright by a contraption built by someone who definitely hated mornings more than you do. Too bad, your bed just ejected you onto the freezing floor like a malfunctioning catapult. Now, picture the room around you. The fire you banked the night before has burned down to a sullen pile of ash. Your breath hangs in the air like a ghost auditioning for a séance. The wallpaper peels in slow, miserable curls, and somewhere in the distance, a milk cart rattles over cobblestones. You're wrapped in 3 layers of wool blankets, each about as soft as a burlap sack stuffed with regret. For a brief moment, you think you might burrow deeper and skip the morning entirely. But no, your bed has other plans. Victorians adored mechanical problem-solving, and waking up late was considered a mechanical problem. The alarm bed was a proud product of this thinking. At its core, it was just a bed frame bolted to a metal contraption, linked to a clockwork mechanism. When the clock struck the appointed time, gears shifted, springs uncoiled, and the bed either tilted you onto the floor or snapped you upright like a jackknife. It was a Victorian eviction notice served directly to your spine. The most basic models tipped you sideways with all the ceremony of an annoyed waiter clearing a table. More advanced versions lifted the head of the bed sharply, forcing you into a sitting position you had not consented to. And then there were the ambitious designs, the ones that rolled the entire mattress, dumping you forward into a waiting pair of boots. The inventor probably called this streamlining your morning routine. You might call it assault. Why go to such extremes? Because in a world ruled by factory whistles and strict train timetables, being late wasn't just inconvenient, it was expensive. Miss the 6:42 to the mill, and you'd lose half a day's wages. Oversleep in a boarding house, and you might lose your job entirely. In that light, a violent mechanical wake-up call started to seem like a reasonable investment. Of course, these machines were not without hazards. There are documented cases of sleepers being flung into washstands, tipped onto chamber pots, or waking to find themselves entangled in their own bedsheets on the cold floor, like a moth in a very confused cocoon. If you were especially unlucky, the bed might malfunction and trigger early, sending you flying into the darkness at 3 a.m. Nothing says good morning like smashing into your own wardrobe before sunrise. And then there was the issue of winter. Imagine being catapulted from your warm nest directly into an unheated room where the temperature hovers somewhere between meat locker and icebox at sea. One second you're dreaming of summer meadows, the next you're on the floor in bare feet, sprinting for your dressing gown like your life depends on it. Which it does, because frostbite has been making eyes at your toes all season. Resetting the bed was a chore all its own. You had to drag the mattress back into place, recompress the spring with a crank or lever, and wind the clockwork mechanism while muttering promises to go to bed earlier. Lies, all lies. And heaven help you if you forgot to secure the latch while resetting, because that meant another unplanned ejection, sometimes while you were still wearing your nightcap. Modern alarms may be annoying, but at least they don't involve blunt force trauma. Your smartphone lets you hit snooze. The Victorian snooze option was to wedge a chair against the bed frame, a solution that worked until the bed launched both you and the chair across the room in an early prototype of extreme sports. Still, for all its violence, the alarm bed did what it promised. It got you out of bed, on time, and into your day, though perhaps also into a lifelong distrust of furniture. It was a perfect reflection of the Victorian mindset, disciplined, inventive, and slightly unhinged. And as you shiver into your trousers and lace your boots, you can't help but glance back at the contraption in the corner. It sits there quietly, innocent for now, but you know better. It's a promise, and tomorrow morning it will keep it. Before you could DM your crush, Victorians had pneumatic tubes, basically, the world's first attempt at office fun and chaos. With a whoosh and a clatter, your handwritten note could go flying through walls, ceilings, or occasionally end up lost forever in a maze of copper pipes, like your dignity after sending a risky text. Picture it. You're in a dim, wood-panelled office that smells of ink, coal smoke, and tea that's been sitting there since Monday. Clerks shuffle papers in stiff collars, the air heavy with the sound of scratching pens and passive-aggressive coughs. Suddenly, thunk, the tube system jolts to life. A brass canister rockets into the receiving station, landing with the force of an enthusiastic pigeon against a window. Someone pops it open, retrieves a folded note, and either nods with satisfaction or frowns like they've just read a polite invitation to duel. The idea was simple. Use pressurized air to move small items between points in a building, or even across entire city blocks. The execution? Gloriously unpredictable. Victorian pneumatic tubes had a knack for making your message feel like it had been on a small but harrowing adventure. You could send a letter from the stockroom to the manager's office and have it arrive perfectly intact, or you could send it and discover hours later that it had taken a detour to the basement, collected dust, and been chewed slightly by an overly curious office mouse. Messages weren't the only thing that travelled by tube. Offices sent coins, receipts, tiny parcels, and once, according to urban legend, a half-eaten sandwich. In London's larger systems, there were even experiments with sending people, which went about as well as you'd expect. Being shot through a pneumatic tube sounds fun for roughly 3 seconds, right until you realise you're essentially a human sausage in a pressurised metal straw. Of course, in the average Victorian office, the tubes were more than just practical, they were entertainment. Workers quickly discovered the joy of sending pranks through them, a paper mouse to terrify the accounting department, a very important message containing only a doodle of the boss, or a small bag of flour that exploded on arrival, ensuring the recipient would spend the rest of the afternoon dusting their waistcoat. But not everyone loved the tubes. Some managers worried they made offices too efficient, reducing the amount of visible, respectable walking around time that proved you were hard at work. Others complained about the noise. A busy day could sound like the building was under attack by a polite but relentless hailstorm, and if the seals weren't tight, the pressure could drop, leaving your message stranded mid-journey, somewhere, unseen, possibly becoming best friends with other lost notes from months ago. Let's not forget the potential for disaster. A tube could burst under pressure, sending a brass canister flying across the room like an angry Victorian torpedo. Imagine explaining that injury to your doctor. I was struck in the head by a strongly worded memo from payroll. And then there was the hygiene issue. These tubes were not cleaned often, meaning your letter passed through miles of dust, ink residue, and the occasional bug that had taken up residence. Receiving a faintly speckled note was just part of the charm. Still, for all their quirks, pneumatic tubes were astonishingly ahead of their time. They shrank the world of communication in the way email and instant messaging would later do, just with more hissing, clattering, and risk of mild concussion. Banks, hotels, post offices, and department stores all adopted them. In some places, the tubes even connected entire neighbourhoods, zipping letters under the streets while their senders enjoyed the smug satisfaction of knowing they'd beaten the horse-drawn post. And yet, they had one more feature modern technology hasn't matched: drama. When a pneumatic tube delivery arrived, it didn't just ping politely. It slammed into the receiver with a finality that said, "This is your message. It is here. Read it now, or it will explode." Opening it felt ceremonial. A tiny theatrical event in the middle of a workday otherwise filled with ledgers and sighing. So yes, the Victorians had their own kind of instant message, one that could cross the building in seconds, carry a coin or a confession, and occasionally scare the life out of you. Compared to our silent, digital pings, the pneumatic dispatch tube was messy, loud, and gloriously over-engineered, but it got the job done. And sometimes, that job was delivering the world's first office meme at 30 miles an hour. You're headed out for a night on the foggy streets of London. Better put on your anti-garrote collar, a massive spiked metal device meant to prevent stranglers, but mostly guaranteed to prevent neck movement and human intimacy. The year is 1862, and the newspapers have been full of terrifying headlines about garrotters, street criminals who sneak up behind you, loop a cord or scarf around your neck, and choke you unconscious before relieving you of your wallet, watch, and possibly your dignity. The Victorians, being the Victorians, responded in their usual way by inventing something both practical and socially awkward. Thus, the anti-garrote collar was born, a hinged metal band lined with spikes, worn beneath or over your cravat. Its job? Make it very unpleasant for anyone to grab you from behind. Its side effect? Make it very unpleasant for anyone to hug you from behind. Picture yourself strapping it on in front of the mirror. The thing is heavy, solid brass or steel, and cold against your skin. The hinges click into place with the grim efficiency of a mousetrap. You tie your cravat over it, hoping to make the whole ensemble look dashing, but instead you resemble a man preparing for polite dinner and medieval combat. The spikes, discreetly hidden or boldly on display depending on your model, press lightly into your neck as a reminder that you are technically wearing a weapon. Now step outside. The fog is so thick you can barely see the glow of the gas lamps. The street smells of wet horse, coal smoke, and optimism gone slightly sour. Somewhere in the gloom, a cart rattles by, and your boots click sharply against the cobblestones. You pass other pedestrians, some of them nodding in approval at your visible commitment to not being strangled, others giving you the wary look reserved for people who might start lecturing about railway timetables. Victorian society had a strange relationship with the anti-garrote collar. On one hand, it was praised as a clever defence against a real danger. On the other, it was mocked as the overreaction of a jittery public. Caricatures in the papers depicted gentlemen so thoroughly armoured they could barely fit through doorways, or couples on the street unable to kiss because their collars had interlocked like dueling helmets. And yes, there were stories of wearers accidentally poking themselves while adjusting their neckties, or snagging their spikes on passing drapery. Still, in the paranoia of the time, the collar sold well. Some designs were collapsible, folding flat so you could discreetly tuck them into your coat pocket until you approached a bad neighbourhood. Others went full fashion statement, with ornate engravings, gold plating, or in one ill-advised case, small bells that jingled as you walked, presumably to warn potential garrotters that you were both armed and festive. Of course, the real test of any anti-garrote collar was whether it worked in the moment. Accounts vary. Some victims claimed their attackers recoiled instantly, hands pierced by the spikes. Others said the collar bought them just enough time to spin around and shout for help. And at least one unfortunate gentleman reported that his assailant simply laughed, removed the collar mid-struggle, and stole it along with his watch. Compared to modern safety devices, pepper spray, personal alarms, smartphones, the anti-garrote collar was blunt, literal, and unapologetically visible. You weren't signalling, "I might have protection." You were announcing, "If you try to strangle me, you'll regret it. Also, please don't ask me to look down at your new shoes because I physically can't." By the late 1860s, the garrote scare had mostly faded, and so did the collar craze. Most ended up in attics, police evidence rooms, or the hands of curious grandchildren who mistook them for very aggressive cake rings. But for a brief moment in history, they were the perfect blend of Victorian paranoia, mechanical ingenuity, and absolute inability to foresee how ridiculous future generations would find them. So the next time you slip on a scarf for warmth, remember, your Victorian counterpart might have been wearing something similar, only heavier, pointier, and far more likely to make a date decide they just want to be friends. Breakfast is dangerous when your facial hair is more ambitious than your job. Enter the Mustache Guard, a tiny, dignified shield that clips to your cup so you don't accidentally dunk your upper lip in your tea. Because nothing says gentleman like sipping your Earl Grey through a tiny fence. In Victorian Britain, the moustache wasn't just facial hair. It was a social statement, a symbol of masculinity, and in some circles, a requirement. Officers in the British military were expected to grow them. Politicians cultivated them. Artists shaped them into flamboyant punctuation marks on their faces. And in an era when hot beverages were part of every civilized moment, the moustache faced its greatest enemy: liquid. Imagine the scene. You're sitting at a cafe table in a fine wool suit. Your moustache waxed into sharp points that could plausibly be used for fencing. The waiter brings your tea, steam curling lazily into the air. You lift the cup, take a sip, and disaster. The heat wilts the wax. The milk leaves a suspicious white froth clinging to the hairs. And now you're not a dignified gentleman. You're a damp walrus in tweed. Enter the Mustache Guard. Usually made of silver or porcelain, it was either a clip-on accessory for your cup or a built-in ceramic barrier in special moustache cups. The design was delightfully literal. A curved plate with a semicircular notch for your lips, blocking liquid while allowing your tea or coffee to pass through a small opening. Think of it as a drawbridge for your drink. The etiquette of using one was almost as important as the guard itself. You didn't just slap it onto your cup and slurp. No, you placed it with care, ensuring the notch aligned perfectly with your mouth. You sipped slowly, letting the hot liquid pass beneath the guard while your moustache remained high and dry, basking in the smug security of being untouched by dairy foam. This was an accessory for a man who had the time and patience to prepare not just his drink, but his drinking experience. Of course, there were the inevitable mishaps. Guards could slip, spilling tea into your lap. A poorly cleaned guard could trap the ghostly flavour of yesterday's coffee, leaving you with a confusing blend of Earl Grey with notes of regret. And heaven help you if you were distracted mid-sip. The rigid guard could press awkwardly against your teeth, producing a noise like someone trying to eat cutlery. Still, the Mustache Guard was wildly popular among the upper and middle classes. Some were engraved with initials or family crests, others decorated with floral designs that looked like they belonged on a very fancy sugar bowl. Travelling gentlemen carried folding versions in leather cases, ready to be deployed at the faintest whiff of a tea service. If the 19th century had influencers, these were the accessories they would have unboxed dramatically on camera, and like any good Victorian invention, it inspired competition. Companies produced dozens of variations: guards with detachable handles, guards that doubled as strainers, guards shaped like miniature castle walls. One particularly impractical version incorporated a tiny hinged door, which you opened to take a sip before quickly shutting again to protect your moustache from rogue splashes, essentially turning tea drinking into a high-stakes mechanical operation. In public, the Mustache Guard wasn't just functional, it was a subtle display of wealth and grooming commitment. A man with a Mustache Guard was telling the world, "I take my tea seriously, my grooming seriously, and also, I have accepted that I will never, ever be able to drink from a disposable paper cup like some kind of barbarian." By the early 20th century, the decline of elaborate facial hair and the rise of more casual coffee culture sent the Mustache Guard into obscurity. Today, they survive mostly in antique shops, often mistaken by the uninitiated for strange soap dishes. But in its heyday, the Mustache Guard was more than a drinking aid. It was a quiet act of rebellion against the forces of moisture and gravity. So next time you sip your latte and worry only about foam on your nose, spare a thought for the Victorian gentleman. He fought his own private battle each morning, armed with nothing but hot tea, stiff wax, and a tiny porcelain shield standing between him and beverage-related humiliation. It's time for your morning health ritual. You know what that means. Leeches. But don't worry, Victorian ingenuity has given us the mechanical leech remover, a device that's half salad tong, half existential crisis. In an era when medical science still liked to throw around the phrase balancing the humours with a straight face, leeches were a staple of healthcare. Fever? Leeches. Headache? Leeches. Vague sense of unease because Mercury is in retrograde? Leeches. They were prescribed like Victorian aspirin. Except instead of swallowing something, you let a small, determined creature turn you into an all-you-can-eat buffet. The problem was, leeches were not big believers in leaving quietly. Once they'd latched on, they were in it for the long haul. You could try prying them off with your fingernails, but that risked leaving behind their mouthparts, something even 19th century doctors agreed was not ideal. Salt and heat could work, but they weren't exactly gentle. So naturally, someone invented a gadget specifically for detaching these unwilling house guests. The mechanical leech remover. Picture it. 2 slender arms made of polished steel, joined by a hinge, with delicately serrated ends designed to grip the slippery body of a leech without squishing it. The whole thing looked like something you might use to serve asparagus at a dinner party hosted by Dracula. Some models even had a spring-loaded mechanism so you could clasp, twist and remove in one smooth motion, like a grim Victorian claw game. Your morning leech removal routine would go something like this. First, identify the leech. Easier said than done if it's hidden in a less than dignified location. Next, brace yourself. The remover's cool metal touches your skin, and you pinch just behind the leech's head. With a tiny tug and a wet plop, it detaches, leaving behind a spot of blood and a faint sense of betrayal. You place the leech in a waiting jar because these little parasites were valuable enough to reuse. Yes, this was not a one-and-done situation. Your leech might work on you today and your cousin tomorrow. Family bonding at its finest. Naturally, there were risks. Squeeze too hard, and you might rupture the leech, leading to an unpleasant cleanup and a disappointed apothecary. Hesitate too long, and the leech might wriggle free, dropping to the floor and starting a new life under the dresser. The Victorians, however, were nothing if not determined, and they treated leech removal with the same meticulousness they applied to polishing their silverware or starching their collars. And because this was the Victorian era, the mechanical leech remover was marketed not just for hospitals and doctors but for home use. Adverts in medical supply catalogues boasted of precision grip and gentle detachment, often illustrated with unsettlingly cheerful engravings of patients having leeches plucked from their necks. The idea was to make the process seem civilized, an efficient, even refined part of your daily health regimen. In reality, there was nothing civilized about it. The device might spare you the indignity of prying a leech off with your bare hands, but it didn't make the experience less intimate. The leech was still warm. It was still wriggling. And somewhere in its tiny annelid brain it was still confused about why breakfast had ended so suddenly. The mechanical leech remover also served as a quiet status symbol. Only those who could afford frequent bleeding treatments and the tools to go with them were likely to own one. In poorer households, leech removal was done the old-fashioned way, by hand, with whatever blunt instrument was nearby, or by simply waiting until the leech got bored and let go. By the early 20th century, the popularity of leech therapy had declined, and with it, the need for specialized removal devices. Today, the mechanical leech remover exists mostly in museums, curiosity shops, or the occasional horror-themed antique collection. But in its heyday, it was a perfect symbol of Victorian medicine, earnest, over-engineered, slightly grotesque, and completely convinced it was helping. So next time you complain about waiting in a modern doctor's office, be grateful you're not sitting there with half a dozen leeches dangling from your limbs, leafing through a magazine from 1883, and waiting for the nurse to come at you with what looks suspiciously like a pair of shiny, blood-slick tongs. Sometimes you want to write your memoirs, but sitting up is just too ambitious. Enter the writing while lying down desk, a contraption that hovers above your bed and guarantees both creativity and permanent neck pain. Victorians loved 2 things: inventing wildly specific solutions to problems no one asked about, and pretending those solutions were deeply dignified. The writing while lying down desk fit both categories perfectly. Imagine a wooden frame that arches over your bed like the skeleton of a particularly pushy tent. From this frame hangs a slanted writing board, carefully positioned above your chest, so you can recline beneath it and scrawl away without the pesky inconvenience of standing, sitting, or otherwise behaving like a normal human. It sounds glamorous, lounging in your nightshirt, quill in hand, scribbling profound thoughts as the morning light filters through lace curtains. but reality had a few sharp edges. First, there's the issue of gravity. Ink flows downward, and when you're lying flat, that down is directly toward your own face. Without careful control, a poetic flourish could quickly become a permanent Rorschach blot across your forehead. And then there was the physical toll. Hours of craning your neck upward to see your own writing, your shoulders locking into a position no anatomy chart would recommend. Still, for the Victorian invalid or the self-declared reclined intellectual, this desk was a marvel. It allowed bedridden writers, whether due to illness, injury, or sheer distaste for chairs, to keep up correspondence, journal, or even work on novels without leaving the comfort of their mattress. Some designs even included candle holders for nighttime inspiration, which was great until you remembered that your writing surface was suspended inches from your highly flammable bedsheets. And because this was the Victorian era, customization was everything. Wealthier users could order models with inlaid wood, velvet padding, or small drawers for ink, sealing wax, and emergency biscuits. One particularly overambitious design incorporated a miniature bookshelf above the writing board, which seemed clever until you realized the inevitable result of reaching for a novel, a hardback edition of Middlemarch to the nose. These desks also created a unique social dynamic. Imagine a friend or servant entering your room to deliver tea, only to find you lying flat on your back, furiously scribbling away beneath a hovering wooden plank like some kind of scholarly beetle trapped under a piece of furniture. It didn't exactly project an air of approachable elegance, but as absurd as it sounds, there was a practical side. In an age before ergonomic chairs or adjustable standing desks, this was one of the few ways to reduce strain for people with chronic pain or serious illness while still allowing them to write. Some medical journals of the time even recommended them for invalid authors, praising the way they encourage productivity without taxing the body, though they were notably less enthusiastic about the long-term spinal consequences. Naturally, the Victorians also found ways to overcomplicate the idea. A few models were fitted with mechanical levers so the writing surface could be tilted, raised, or folded away without the user leaving bed. In theory, this made them versatile. In practice, it made them one broken spring away from collapsing directly onto your nose in the middle of a sentence. And of course, this kind of indulgence invited mockery. Satirical newspapers printed cartoons of bloated aristocrats, dictating their memoirs to servants while lying beneath ornate desks, sipping wine, and occasionally dozing off mid-sentence. The joke was clear. If you were using one of these contraptions, you were either very ill, very wealthy, or very committed to never, ever standing up again. By the early 20th century, the writing while lying down desk fell out of fashion, replaced by lighter lap desks and, eventually, typewriters that demanded a more upright posture. Today, they survive mostly as oddities in antique shops, beautifully crafted, faintly ridiculous monuments to an era when invention often meant adding more wood, more hinges, and more opportunities for disaster. So next time you're slouched on the couch with a laptop propped on your knees, remember, you're participating in a proud tradition of horizontal productivity. The Victorians just did it with more mahogany, more ink stains, and a much higher risk of concussion. Nothing says health and beauty like strapping yourself into a corset and then running a mild electric current through your rib cage. The electric corset claimed to cure everything from back pain to laziness. The real cure? Taking it off. The Victorians were obsessed with electricity. It was new, mysterious, and, according to advertisements, capable of fixing absolutely everything. Got a headache? Electricity. Weak knees? Electricity. Romantic disappointment? Almost certainly electricity. So it was only a matter of time before some inventive soul decided to merge the era's two great passions, tight-laced fashion and experimental medicine, into one horrifying garment, the electric corset. Imagine the scene. You're standing in your bedroom, staring at what looks like a perfectly ordinary corset until you notice the thin wires and the small, ominous-looking battery pack dangling from one side. The instructions, printed in a flourish of confident Victorian type, promise vital stimulation of the nerves, improved posture, and a general quickening of the spirit. What they don't promise is avoiding the sensation of being gently electrocuted while trying to walk down the street without passing out. Putting it on was already a production. First, you'd lace yourself in until your waist was cinched to something approaching the circumference of a dinner plate. Then you'd attach the small electrodes, usually sewn into the lining, so they made contact with your skin. Finally, you'd clip the wires to the battery, a dry cell, or, in some cases, a hand-crank dynamo carried discreetly in a pocket. Yes, that's right. Some wearers literally powered their undergarments by turning a crank. Once activated, the corset would deliver intermittent pulses of electricity to the torso. The sensation varied depending on the design. Some gave a faint, tingling buzz. Others a more assertive jolt that could make your teeth click together. The manufacturers insisted this was invigorating, encouraging better blood circulation, stronger muscles, and an upright carriage. In reality, it mostly encouraged you to question your life choices. And yet, the electric corset wasn't purely a fad for the desperate. It tapped into the genuine excitement about the medical potential of electricity in the late 19th century. Doctors experimented with electrical stimulation for muscle weakness, paralysis, and pain relief. The corset simply brought that science into the domestic sphere, though with considerably less testing and considerably more risk of accidentally zapping yourself while bending over to pick up a dropped glove. There were, of course, hazards. Early electrical insulation wasn't exactly reliable, meaning a faulty corset could deliver shocks in unintended areas. Overheating batteries were another concern, especially the liquid-filled types, which could leak corrosive acid into the fabric. And if you happened to wear your electric corset in a rainstorm, well, let's just say you'd be more than invigorated. Despite the risks, these garments were marketed with relentless optimism. Advertisements featured beaming ladies in fashionable silhouettes, their posture impeccable, their cheeks rosy with electrical vitality. Slogans promised youthful energy restored and a gentle cure for the ailments of modern life. One manufacturer even suggested the corset could promote cheerfulness, which, given the circumstances, is a level of ambition bordering on delusion. Some versions went even further, incorporating magnets alongside the electrodes, because if one pseudoscience was good, two had to be better. Others were sold for men as electric belts designed to treat nervous exhaustion, a delicately phrased Victorian euphemism that covered everything from general fatigue to, well, let's just say, matters best left private. By the turn of the 20th century, as medical standards tightened and electricity became less mysterious, the electric corset began to fade from fashion. Consumers grew wary of being both cinched and shocked, and doctors became more vocal about the dangers. The surviving examples today are mostly found in museums, looking deceptively harmless until you notice the faint scorch marks along the seams. Still, the electric corset remains one of the most wonderfully absurd artifacts of the Victorian age, a perfect storm of beauty standards, medical quackery, and technological enthusiasm. It was part torture device, part fashion statement, and part science experiment, worn with absolute confidence by people who genuinely believed it was the future of health. So the next time you complain about your modern shapewear being uncomfortable, remember, at least it doesn't require batteries, a hand crank, and the willingness to risk mild electrocution for the sake of a smaller waist. In the grand scheme of things, we've come a long way, though not nearly far enough to keep the Victorians from haunting us with their more shocking ideas. Ever wanted to bathe in public? No? Victorians did, or at least pretended to. The portable bathtub could be folded up, dragged into a train car, or set up in a field. Hygiene, now with bonus humiliation. Victorian Britain was a nation in love with progress, convenience, and making everything unnecessarily complicated. And while public bathhouses existed, they were crowded, noisy, and occasionally home to diseases you didn't want to collect. For those who valued both cleanliness and a flair for the dramatic, there was the portable bathtub, an invention that promised to bring the luxury of a hot soak anywhere you pleased, whether that was a railway compartment, a picnic site, or the middle of a military encampment. Picture it. A collapsible tub made of waterproof canvas or sheet metal, with folding wooden or iron supports. When packed up, it resembled a large, awkward suitcase, the kind that immediately tells strangers, "Yes, I am carrying something ridiculous." When unfolded, it became a vessel just big enough for one determined bather who had stopped caring about dignity sometime in the last 5 minutes. The appeal was obvious on paper. You could travel long distances without sacrificing your bathing schedule, or set up a hot soak in the countryside while your companions awkwardly pretended not to notice. Military officers took them on campaigns, explorers brought them into the jungle, and wealthier tourists insisted on them during long rail journeys because nothing says aristocratic leisure like taking a bath while the countryside whizzes past your soapy elbows. Of course, the logistics were less charming. First, you needed water, lots of it. That meant hauling buckets from a pump, a stream, or whatever passed for a clean source nearby. Then you had to heat it, which involved a fire, a large kettle, and a great deal of patience. By the time your bath was ready, you'd already sweated enough to need another one. And because portable tubs weren't exactly insulated, the water cooled quickly, turning your relaxing soak into an icy endurance test. Privacy was another issue. Some portable tubs came with tall canvas screens to shield the bather from public view. But shield was a generous term. A strong breeze could turn your screen into a Victorian peep show in seconds. Even indoors, you were at the mercy of curious onlookers, servants coming in with towels, or children loudly asking, "Why is Uncle George sitting in a bucket?" The tubs themselves were not always comfortable. The metal ones could burn your skin if the water was too hot, or chill it instantly if the temperature dropped. The canvas models sagged under your weight, threatening to collapse and send you rolling across the floor in a wave of lukewarm water. And if you were taller than average, congratulations, you now had to choose between keeping your knees underwater or keeping your shoulders warm, but never both at once. Still, the Victorians persevered. They saw portable bathing not as an eccentricity but as a sign of refinement. If you could keep yourself clean on the road, you were a person of discipline and taste. Never mind that you were also a person dripping water onto the carpet of a first-class train compartment. The portable bathtub even inspired variants. Foot baths for quick refreshment, hip baths for therapeutic purposes, and elaborate models with built-in soap holders and small shelves for reading material. One ambitious design featured a wooden lid that could be closed over the bather, transforming the whole contraption into a piece of furniture when not in use, although anyone sitting on it while you were still inside was in for a rude surprise. By the early 20th century, as indoor plumbing spread, the portable bathtub's heyday faded. Yet it never vanished entirely. Soldiers in remote outposts still used them, campers swore by them, and eccentric travellers continued to insist that bathing al fresco was invigorating if you ignored the occasional sheep wandering past. Today, surviving examples are mostly found in museums or antique fairs, looking deceptively practical until you remember the reality of filling, heating, and sitting in one. But in its prime, the portable bathtub was the perfect Victorian blend of earnestness, engineering, and unnecessary spectacle. A way to say, yes, I am civilized, and yes, I will prove it, even if it takes 3 hours and a complete loss of personal privacy. So the next time you step into a modern, temperature-controlled shower in the comfort of your home, spare a thought for the adventurous Victorians, hunched in their folding tubs, soap in hand, praying their bathwater wouldn't spill into the luggage compartment before they'd finished rinsing. London's air was so bad even Victorians got tired of coughing up coal, so they invented the drinking smoke machine, a bizarre filter you'd literally inhale air through, because nothing says progress like sipping purified smog from a metal straw. To understand why anyone thought this was a good idea, you have to picture Victorian London's atmosphere, not so much fog as industrial soup. Coal fires burned in homes, factories belched out black clouds, and horse manure baked in the sun while chimney sweeps kicked up more dust just for good measure. Breathing was, essentially, an extreme sport. So the drinking smoke machine appeared as a noble, if slightly unhinged, attempt to give the lungs a fighting chance. The device itself looked like something between a steampunk hookah and a brass trumpet mouthpiece. You'd hold it to your lips, draw in air through a series of small chambers packed with wool, sponge, or even bits of charcoal, and hope that the worst of London's airborne horrors stayed trapped inside. The term drinking came from the idea that you were sipping air the way you might sip tea, slowly, delicately, and ideally without choking. Of course, the Victorians couldn't stop at mere practicality. These machines came in ornate designs, engraved with swirls, flowers, and the occasional royal crest. Some were pocket-sized for use on the go, while others were larger, home-based contraptions with tubes that allowed multiple family members to drink from the same air source, a concept that sounds charming until you realize it's basically a communal lung straw. The promotional materials were nothing short of optimistic. Adverts claimed the machine could cleanse the atmosphere of all noxious particles, cure chronic cough, and even invigorate the constitution. One particularly bold pamphlet suggested it could improve moral character, as though a few sips of clean air might inspire you to finally pay back that friend you still owe 2 shillings. Using one in public, however, was a social gamble. Imagine standing on a street corner, clutching a metal filter to your mouth, and taking slow, deliberate breaths while passers-by tried to figure out whether you were inhaling medicine or rehearsing for a tuba solo. Some users tried to make it fashionable by pairing it with walking sticks or parasols, but the overall effect was still more eccentric uncle than trendsetter. And then there was the maintenance. The filters needed regular cleaning, ideally after each use, which meant carefully removing damp, soot-stained sponges and wringing them out like tiny, revolting dishcloths. Neglect this step, and your purified air would soon take on a distinctive aroma of wet coal and despair. Not that everyone bothered. The allure of the drinking smoke machine wasn't necessarily that it worked flawlessly, it was that it offered hope. In an era where most health advice ranged from questionable to actively dangerous, this gadget felt like progress. It gave the user the sense of taking control, of fighting back against the endless tide of industrial grime, even if only in small, wheezy gulps. Some models even experimented with adding scents to the filtered air, lavender, eucalyptus, or peppermint, turning each breath into a perfumed little escape from reality. Of course, the peppermint ones were particularly risky if you miscalculated your inhale and accidentally coughed the entire device into your lap. By the early 20th century, improvements in urban sanitation and a slow decline in coal use began to make such contraptions less necessary. Still, a few stubborn Victorians clung to their drinking smoke machines, convinced that modern air was just as dangerous, only sneakier. Today, surviving examples sit in museums and private collections, where they're admired for their intricate craftsmanship and quietly mocked for their underlying absurdity. Looking back, the drinking smoke machine is peak Victorian problem-solving. Half genuine health measure, half theatrical prop, and entirely too confident in its own importance. It's the kind of invention that could only have come from a society convinced that the best way to deal with filthy air was to politely sip it through a portable teapot for your lungs. So the next time you breathe deeply on a clean, breezy day, be grateful you're not hunched over a brass contraption, sipping industrial smog, one genteel puff at a time, while hoping the filter doesn't smell worse than the street outside. Politeness was a full-time job. If you were too lazy to tip your hat in greeting, simply wear the hat tip indicator, a spring-loaded arm that does the hat raising for you, leaving your real arm free for more important things, like holding your 4th cup of tea. In Victorian society, manners were not optional. They were a form of currency. The right bow, the perfect handshake, the precisely timed tip of the hat could be the difference between being welcomed into polite society and being quietly talked about behind lace fans for the next decade. But all that courteous gesturing took work. Imagine the strain of raising your arm dozens, maybe hundreds of times a day just to acknowledge every acquaintance, colleague, and cousin you passed on the street. Enter the hat tip indicator, a device for the gentleman, or occasionally lady, who valued good manners but valued physical conservation even more. The basic design was simple yet absurd. The small, discreet mechanism, usually made of brass, was attached to the brim of your hat. This was connected to a spring-loaded lever or cord that ran down the inside of the hatband and out to a small trigger, often hidden in the wearer's pocket. A quick squeeze of the trigger and snap, the brim of the hat lifted in a polite little nod before settling back into place. To onlookers, it appeared as though you'd tipped your hat with invisible hands, which admittedly may have been slightly unsettling if they didn't know about the gadget. Some models were even more theatrical. They could fully lift the hat from your head, pivot it slightly, and then set it back down again in one smooth motion, all without you so much as flexing a bicep. A few extravagant versions were powered by clockwork mechanisms, meaning you could pre-wind your greetings for the day and let the device do the social heavy lifting while you strolled along, hands in pockets. The hat tip indicator was marketed as a marvel of modern convenience, assisting the gentleman in his duties of cordiality without undue fatigue. In truth, it was also a subtle boast. Owning one suggested you had so many social obligations that you needed mechanical help just to keep up with the demand for politeness. Why simply greet a passing acquaintance when you could greet them with technology? Of course, the device wasn't without its pitfalls. Springs could snap, sending your hat flying into the street, or worse, into a puddle of Victorian street slush, a mixture of rainwater, horse droppings, and things best left unidentified. The cord could get tangled, causing your hat to twitch uncontrollably, making you look less like a refined gentleman and more like you were being harassed by a ghost. And heaven help you if you activated it accidentally during a solemn occasion. Nothing kills the mood at a funeral like a jaunty mechanical hat salute. There was also the question of authenticity. Some traditionalists scoffed at the hat tip indicator, insisting that manners required genuine physical effort to be sincere. Others saw it as a harmless novelty, a playful twist on a deeply ingrained ritual. Satirical magazines lampooned the device, printing cartoons of men so lazy they had machines to shake hands, nod their heads, and even smile on their behalf. Yet, for all its oddness, the hat tip indicator did have genuine uses. People with arm injuries or disabilities could use it to maintain the social niceties without pain. Certain professions that required keeping hands occupied, like porters or shopkeepers, found it genuinely practical. And for the gadget-loving Victorian, it was simply another delightful contraption to show off at dinner parties, preferably by demonstrating its flawless operation while holding a glass of sherry. By the early 20th century, as hat-wearing etiquette relaxed and technology turned its attention to bigger problems, the hat tip indicator quietly fell out of fashion. Today, it's a charming relic of an age when manners were elaborate, engineering was ambitious, and no one thought twice about strapping springs and gears to their head in the name of civility. So next time you give someone a lazy nod across the street, remember, a Victorian gentleman could have done that same gesture without moving a single muscle, provided he was willing to risk the occasional public decapitation by spring in the name of impeccable manners. Victorian hats are fashion statements, but don't go too wide. Obstruction of view by means of ostentatious headwear is a misdemeanor, and the judge is not amused by your tragic millinery choices. To a Victorian, a hat wasn't just an accessory, it was a public declaration of who you were, what you could afford, and how many birds you were willing to balance on your head at one time. This was an age when feathers were plucked from exotic species, when hatpins could double as defensive weapons, and when the brim was not a mere shade giver but an architectural feat. And while society adored a bit of grandeur, there was a tipping point, literally, where a fashionable brim became a public hazard. The problem was one of physics. A moderately wide brim could frame the face, keep the sun off, and impress passers-by without incident. But as competition among milliners grew, brims began to stretch outward like eager parasols, sometimes measuring over 2 feet in diameter. Step into a crowded theatre wearing one of these creations, and you'd single-handedly block the view of everyone in the next 3 rows. Opera houses complained, courtrooms issued fines, and satirical newspapers began sketching women whose hats looked like inverted dining tables. The law eventually stepped in. Certain municipalities passed ordinances against obstruction by millinery, which may be the most British-sounding crime in history. Imagine being arrested not for theft or disorderly conduct, but for existing in a public space with a brim so large it cast a shadow over a stranger's dinner. The typical penalty was a fine, though persistent offenders could be hauled before a magistrate, a spectacle in itself, since the offending hat often had to be brought along as evidence. But for some wearers, that was part of the thrill. A gigantic brim wasn't just a fashion choice, it was an act of defiance. It said, "Yes, I know you can't see past me, but have you seen the ostrich plume on this thing?" These hats became status symbols at promenades, race days, and open-air markets. The largest brims were reinforced with whalebone or wire to keep them from sagging, though this had the side effect of making them lethal in high winds. A sudden gust could turn you into an unwilling sailboat, dragging you halfway down the street before you regained your footing. The hazards didn't stop there. On busy streets, an oversized brim could knock over merchandise, sweep drinks off cafe tables, or slap unsuspecting pedestrians in the face. At social gatherings, turning your head too quickly could send your hat colliding with candelabras or other people's hair arrangements, resulting in awkward apologies and the occasional small fire. Naturally, satirists had a field day. Punch magazine published illustrations of brims so wide they needed their own carriage. One fictional patent depicted a hat with built-in windows, so people sitting behind you at the theatre could still see the stage. Another proposed a collapsible brim that could be folded up like an umbrella, ideal for navigating narrow hallways without causing structural damage. Despite the mockery, many Victorians adored the drama of excessive brim wear. Photographs from the era show women posing proudly in hats that resemble picnic shelters, surrounded by admiring, or at least resigned, friends. Milliners, sensing an opportunity, began offering brim consultations to help customers balance size with navigability, a service that must have involved a great deal of diplomacy. By the early 20th century, the pendulum of fashion swung back towards smaller, neater headwear, partly due to changing tastes, and partly because public transportation made manoeuvring massive hats nearly impossible. But for a glorious few decades, Britain's streets were dotted with moving, feathered canopies, each one a testament to the Victorian belief that more was always better, at least until the law said otherwise. So the next time you slip on a baseball cap and think, "This is a bit big," remember, you're still miles away from the kind of hat that could earn you a fine, a court appearance, and a starring role in a cartoon titled The Woman Who Blocked Out the Sun. In the Victorian age, fashion didn't just make a statement, it occasionally committed a misdemeanour. Serving sugar at a Victorian tea party was already a high-pressure job, but the electric sugar tongs made it electrifying, literally. A small current zapped any guest who grabbed an extra lump. The etiquette police are always watching. Tea was the beating heart of Victorian social life. It was where reputations were built, alliances were forged, and grudges were politely simmered under layers of sponge cake. But tea also came with rules, so many rules, that a newcomer could spend more time worrying about which spoon to use than actually drinking their tea. And one of the most fiercely guarded customs was sugar etiquette. Sugar was not just sweetener, it was status. Imported from the colonies and refined in great brick factories, it wasn't cheap, and adding too much to your cup could be seen as greedy, childish, or, worst of all, common. Hosts who wanted to keep order, or who simply enjoyed seeing their guests mildly electrocuted, could employ the latest in drawing room discipline: the electric sugar tongs. The design was deceptively dainty. The tongs looked like ordinary silver-plated sugar servers, polished to a blinding shine and resting demurely beside the sugar bowl. But hidden within the handles was a small electrical mechanism, powered by a dry cell or hand-cranked generator under the table. When the unsuspecting guest reached for that tempting second lump, they completed the circuit, and zap! A sharp but harmless shock shot through their fingers. The theory was simple. 1 lump of sugar was acceptable, 2 was suspicious, and 3 was grounds for social exile. The tongs acted as both deterrent and entertainment, offering the host a discreet way to control portion sizes while providing the rest of the table with a delightful little spectacle. After all, nothing livens up polite conversation like the sight of your neighbour yelping and dropping a sugar cube into the milk jug. In practice, the results could be unpredictable. Different guests reacted in different ways. Some laughed it off, others looked deeply offended, and a few attempted revenge by passing the tongs to another unsuspecting victim. On particularly lively afternoons, the sugar bowl could become the centre of a full-fledged parlour game, with guests daring each other to survive the zap with a steady hand. Not everyone approved, of course. Traditionalists argued that electrifying your tea service was crass, a vulgar blending of technology and hospitality. One ought to trust one's guests. Sniffed one etiquette manual, and if they take liberties with sugar, one ought to take liberties with the friendship. But as with many Victorian inventions, curiosity often outweighed propriety, and the electric sugar tongs found a place in homes that prided themselves on being modern, playful, and just a little bit wicked. Naturally, manufacturers competed to make them fancier. Some added decorative engravings or ivory handles, others disguised the wiring so cleverly that even a mechanically minded guest couldn't spot it. There were even adjustable models that let the host increase or decrease the voltage depending on whether they wanted to offer a gentle warning or a memorable lesson in moderation. And yes, there were mishaps. A faulty circuit could deliver a shock far stronger than intended, leading to spilt tea, shattered cups, and one memorable incident in which a startled clergyman launched a scone across the room. Moisture was another problem. Spilled tea or condensation could short the device entirely, meaning that sometimes it was the host who ended up getting zapped during cleanup. By the early 20th century, as electric novelty items fell out of fashion and sugar became less of a luxury, the electric sugar tongs retreated into the realm of oddities. Today, surviving examples are found in museum collections or sold at auction as conversation pieces, a label that remains remarkably accurate. Looking back, the electric sugar tongs perfectly capture the spirit of the Victorian age, a mix of technological enthusiasm, social formality, and a willingness to risk mild bodily harm for the sake of manners. They were an invention that turned the genteel ritual of tea drinking into a tiny, sparkling battlefield, where only the most restrained, or the most shock-resistant, emerged unscathed. So the next time you sweeten your tea without fear of electrocution, spare a thought for the Victorians, who managed to turn even a bowl of sugar into an adventure in both etiquette and electrical engineering. Sweating in your corset? Of course you are. That's why the pneumatic corset fan was invented, a tiny hand-pump device to circulate fresh air under your layers. It probably just fanned your self-loathing. Victorian fashion was never about comfort. A lady's silhouette was to be smooth, sculpted, and cinched within an inch of her ability to breathe. Corsets did the job. But they came with a price: heat, restricted movement, and the occasional sensation that your ribs were plotting their escape. Layer on petticoats, bustles, and heavy fabrics, and you essentially had a human pressure cooker walking around in polite society. Enter the pneumatic corset fan, a small but ambitious contraption that promised relief. The concept was straightforward. Place a discreet air tube inside the corset, attach it to a tiny hand pump, sometimes hidden in a pocket or reticule, and use it to circulate cool air under all that fabric. In theory, this created a refreshing breeze where you needed it most. In practice, the effectiveness depended entirely on the day's air quality, meaning that in the middle of a London summer, you might just be pumping warm, coal-scented smog directly into your undergarments. The device came in several designs. Some were operated manually. You'd give the pump a few squeezes whenever the fainting spells felt imminent. Others used small bellows tucked discreetly into the folds of your skirt, inflating and deflating as you walked to create a continuous waft. The more elaborate models even claimed to purify the air with small charcoal filters, though how well they filtered out the bouquet of horse manure, factory smoke, and humanity's collective perspiration remains questionable. Using one in public was a delicate art. Done subtly, it was almost invisible. A quick squeeze of the hand pump while seated at tea, perhaps mistaken for a gentle fidget. Done clumsily, it looked like you were either inflating a small balloon inside your dress or preparing to launch yourself into orbit. There were stories, probably exaggerated, of overzealous users pumping so vigorously that their corsets audibly wheezed, drawing every eye in the room. Despite the potential for embarrassment, the pneumatic corset fan had its devotees. Women in hotter climates found it genuinely useful, especially during outdoor events like garden parties or summer weddings. In the colonies, where European fashions collided disastrously with tropical heat, the fan was hailed as a lifesaver, albeit one that occasionally made odd hissing noises in polite company. But as with all Victorian inventions, there were hazards. A poorly fitted tube could pinch or chafe, and an air leak might whistle loudly with every breath. Pumps sometimes malfunctioned, leaving you with a deflated, sagging apparatus under your gown, an effect no amount of lace could disguise. And if the device became overheated from too much use, it could turn your corset into a sort of personal greenhouse, undoing any cooling you'd managed to achieve. Manufacturers, ever eager to upsell, began offering luxury versions. These featured silk-covered tubing, gold-plated pumps, and even scented filters that wafted lavender or rosewater as you moved. This added a new layer of social signalling. If people caught a whiff of violets when you entered the room, they knew you were both fashionable and in possession of the latest pneumatic technology. By the turn of the century, improvements in clothing design and the slow loosening of rigid dress codes made the pneumatic corset fan less necessary. Lighter fabrics, looser fits, and the gradual decline of full-day corset wear meant women could breathe and cool down without mechanical assistance. But for a brief, glittering moment in fashion history, The pneumatic corset fan represented the perfect Victorian compromise, acknowledging that the clothes might be unbearable, but refusing to change them in favour of comfort. Today, the surviving examples are mostly museum curiosities, displayed alongside other ingenious yet slightly desperate contraptions of the age. Looking at them, you can almost imagine the relief they must have brought, and the sheer determination it took to wear a steel-boned garment in midsummer and still pretend you are having the time of your life. So the next time you feel warm in your modern breathable clothes, remember the Victorian lady discreetly squeezing her corset pump under the table, praying that the breeze it delivered would be enough to keep her from swooning face first into the sponge cake. If you couldn't be bothered with the hat tip indicator, go full auto with the self-tipping hat. A subtle mechanism inside would bow your hat for you at the push of a button. The Victorian answer to social anxiety. In an era when manners could make or break your reputation, the self-tipping hat promised to eliminate the risk of forgetting a polite gesture. A hat tip wasn't just a greeting, it was a coded signal of respect, flirtation, or deference, depending on the tilt, timing, and accompanying facial expression. Unfortunately, executing that perfect motion over and over again in a day could become tedious, and for the shy or socially awkward, it was a minefield of possible faux pas. What if you forgot to tip to someone important? Or worse, tip to someone you weren't supposed to acknowledge at all? Enter the self-tipping hat. A contraption for those who wanted the social benefits of etiquette without the mental load of remembering to perform it. Inside the crown, a series of tiny gears and springs, often borrowed from Clockwork designs, waited for activation. At the push of a concealed button, usually hidden in a coat pocket or sewn into the lining, the hat would dip forward at just the right angle, pause for a fraction of a second, and then return to its original position. It was like having a butler dedicated solely to your head. For the fashion-conscious, these hats were made in every style, from modest bowlers to extravagant toppers, ensuring that the automation didn't clash with your overall aesthetic. Some even had adjustable settings: formal bow for dignitaries, quick nod for acquaintances, and a jaunty, drawn-out tilt for potential romantic interests. It didn't take long for the device to become a conversation piece. Demonstrating it at dinner parties was practically a sport, with proud owners sending their hats into elaborate greeting routines while they sipped sherry. But there were also cautionary tales. Misfires at the wrong moment could spell disaster. Imagine your hat dipping graciously to a passing stranger, just as your wife walked into view, or saluting an enemy across the street. One particularly famous incident involved a politician whose self-tipping hat malfunctioned mid-speech, nodding furiously through his entire address as though agreeing with every word from his opponent. There were also mechanical risks. The springs could weaken, resulting in half-hearted dips that made you look tired or disinterested. Overwinding the mechanism might send your hat into an aggressive series of bobs, as if possessed. And in windy weather, the automation sometimes combined disastrously with the elements, whipping the hat clean off the wearer's head. Still, for all its quirks, the self-tipping hat appealed to a very Victorian instinct, the belief that technology could and should refine human behaviour. This was the age of mechanical letter openers, steam-powered lawnmowers, and even clockwork servants. Why shouldn't your hat be a participant in the Great March of Progress? Some manufacturers marketed it directly to businessmen, promising that no important client would ever feel snubbed again. Others aimed at the bashful young man, hoping to impress without risking a verbal fumble. After all, a silent, elegant tip from across the room could speak volumes. The military even toyed with the idea of a regimented self-tipping hat for ceremonial salutes, though concerns about synchronized malfunctions quickly ended that experiment. By the dawn of the 20th century, shifting fashion trends and the gradual decline of hat etiquette made the device less relevant. But for a brief time, it stood as the pinnacle of politeness automation, a wearable reminder that in Victorian society, appearances mattered, and a single missed greeting could undo years of careful reputation building. Today, the few surviving examples sit in museums and private collections, their brass gears still faintly gleaming under the felt. They're relics of a world where good manners could be engineered, and where even the simple act of tipping your hat might involve a hidden network of springs, levers, and a button pressed in your pocket. So next time you give someone a nod without thinking, remember, a Victorian gentleman might have done the same thing with a top hat that bowed for him. Perfectly timed, flawlessly executed, and, if the mechanism jammed, possibly still bowing long after the moment had passed. For the Victorian who wanted to make every meal a memento mori, the dinner table coffin was a real thing, a casket-shaped dining table, complete with brass handles. Eat, drink, and be wary. Victorian dining rooms were already stages for elaborate rituals. Every fork had a purpose, every napkin fold was deliberate, and even the order of conversation topics was quietly policed by etiquette. But some households took things a step further, introducing furniture designed not just to impress guests, but to remind them of life's ultimate deadline. The dinner table coffin was exactly what it sounds like, a rectangular dining table built to mimic a full-sized coffin, often crafted from dark mahogany, and finished with ornate carvings that wouldn't look out of place in a mortuary. In an age obsessed with death, mourning clothes, post-mortem photography, hair jewellery, it was perhaps inevitable that the Victorians would invite mortality to the dinner table. The memento mori tradition encouraged people to remember that life was fleeting, and nothing says carpe diem quite like eating roast beef over a surface shaped for your eventual eternal rest. These tables were conversation starters of the highest order. Guests arriving for supper might at first chuckle awkwardly, assuming it was a Halloween prop, until they realised it was a permanent fixture. Some hosts leaned into the macabre theme, decorating the table with funereal black cloth, silver candlesticks shaped like skulls, and floral arrangements that looked suspiciously like wreaths from a graveside service. Others took a subtler approach, relying on the craftsmanship alone to do the talking. Smooth polished wood, gleaming metal fittings, and a lid-like tabletop that could, in theory, be removed. And yes, there were rumours. Whispered accounts claimed that some dinner table coffins could be converted into an actual usable casket should the need arise. Was it morbid thriftiness? A grim joke? Or simply a clever marketing gimmick by overzealous furniture makers? Whatever the case, the thought of carving your Sunday roast on something that might one day carry you to your grave added a certain spice to the meal. Practicality was not entirely absent. The brass handles, for example, made the table easier to move when rearranging the dining room, and the sturdy, coffin-like frame meant these tables often lasted generations, becoming heirlooms that were both cherished and slightly unsettling. This was your grandmother's, a family might say, and also, one day, it could be yours in more ways than one. Dinner parties at such a table were often tinged with gallows humour. Guests might joke about reserving their spot or speculate who would need the table next. In more earnest households, the coffin table served as a reminder to appreciate one's blessings and make the most of every gathering. However odd the decor, of course, not everyone approved. Some clergy viewed the design as irreverent, even sacrilegious, while more delicate guests might find their appetites dampened. Imagine trying to enjoy a custard tart while staring at a brass plaque reading, "Rest in peace." The juxtaposition of fine dining and funereal imagery was, for some, simply too much. As the 20th century approached, the dinner table coffin faded from fashion, swept away by lighter, more cheerful interior trends. Yet a few examples survive in antique shops and museums, where they continue to fascinate and unsettle in equal measure. Standing before one, it's easy to picture the flicker of candlelight across polished wood, the murmur of conversation, and the unspoken awareness that life, like supper, always comes to an end. So the next time you sit down to a meal, be grateful for the plain, coffin-free table in front of you. The Victorians may have had style, craftsmanship, and an unrivaled flair for morbidity, but they also had a way of making every bite taste faintly of existential dread. Punishments got creative too. The revolving prison spun miscreants round and round for hours, the 19th century version of being forced to ride a carnival attraction until you rethought your life choices. The Victorian justice system was fond of mixing morality with mechanical ingenuity. Where earlier centuries might have favoured a good old-fashioned pillory or public flogging, the 19th century prided itself on more refined punishments, by which they meant devices that looked like industrial equipment and caused discomfort in a way you could describe as character-building rather than barbaric. The revolving prison was one such invention. Part disciplinary tool, part humiliation device, and part science experiment in how long it takes for the human stomach to rebel. Picture a giant human hamster wheel, only it's built from sturdy wooden slats and mounted so it can spin at a steady pace. Offenders, usually petty criminals, debtors, or the chronically unruly, would be placed inside and required to walk continuously to keep the wheel moving. In some versions, the motion was powered by the prisoner's own effort, meaning the punishment was also a workout. Other models were cranked by guards, forcing the prisoner to endure the endless spin whether they liked it or not. The theory was that the monotonous, disorienting movement would wear down both body and spirit, leaving the offender chastened and unlikely to reoffend. In reality, the results were mixed. Some prisoners became so dizzy they couldn't stand afterward, collapsing in the yard like sailors after a storm. Others treated it like an endurance challenge, boasting about how many hours they could go without losing their lunch. Public humiliation was built into the design. These revolving prisons were often positioned in open courtyards, where townsfolk could stroll by, watch the human carousel in action, and perhaps bring their children for a teachable moment. See, Tommy? That's what happens when you steal a loaf of bread. This was punishment as spectacle, a moral lesson wrapped in the faintly comic image of a grown man trudging endlessly in circles. It wasn't without hazards. Poorly maintained wheels could jerk or wobble unexpectedly, sending prisoners sprawling against the wooden slats. In hot weather, the enclosed space became stifling. In winter, frostbite was a risk for exposed fingers gripping the rails. Some designs even included partitions, placing multiple prisoners in separate cells on the same wheel, ensuring that if you were going to be dizzy, you'd at least have company. Of course, the Victorians couldn't resist adding a work element. In certain prisons, the revolving mechanism was connected to grain mills or water pumps, so that each step powered some useful task. The offender's shame was thus converted into flour for the community, or clean water for the guards, a small but satisfying victory for the moral overseers. Critics argued that the revolving prison was unnecessarily cruel and potentially damaging to health. Prolonged dizziness, muscle strain, and nausea could linger for days. Reformers pointed out that it did little to address the root causes of crime, unless those causes happened to be a lack of spinning in one's life. But for decades, the device held its place as a practical, mechanical embodiment of Victorian discipline. By the early 20th century, the revolving prison fell out of favour, replaced by more scientific correctional methods, which often turned out to be equally strange. Yet its legacy endures in the occasional fairground ride that leaves you woozy in questioning your life choices. So next time you stagger off a spinning teacup ride or regret getting on a merry-go-round after lunch, remember, once upon a time, that queasy off-balance feeling wasn't just entertainment, it was justice. And somewhere in a dusty museum, there's probably still a wooden wheel that once served as the Victorian answer to both punishment and motion sickness training. Victorian gloves were tight enough to cut off circulation, so the glove stretcher was born, a scissor-like device used to force your gloves into shape, and maybe your hands out of them. In the Victorian era, gloves weren't just an accessory, they were a moral obligation. A properly dressed lady or gentleman wouldn't dream of stepping outside without them. Gloves kept your hands clean, signalled your social status, and in theory, prevented the spread of disease, although in practice they were often dirtier than the hands they covered. But fashion demanded that they fit like a second skin, smooth, snug, and utterly unforgiving if your fingers dared to be larger than the pattern maker's ideal. This is where the glove stretcher came in. Looking suspiciously like a pair of elongated scissors, the device had rounded wooden or ivory blades that slid inside the fingers of a glove. A gentle squeeze on the handles would spread the blades apart, stretching the leather just enough to make it wearable without splitting the seams. At least, that was the goal. In less careful hands, the glove stretcher could just as easily overdo it, leaving you with warped fingers that looked like they belonged to a cartoon character. Glove stretching was a pre-event ritual. Before a ball, garden party, or theatre outing, you might sit at your dressing table with your gloves laid out like delicate prey. A servant, because of course the upper classes wouldn't wrestle with their own accessories, would insert the stretcher into each finger, working methodically to ease the material without damaging it. For the middle classes without help, it was a test of dexterity, patience, and how many swear words you could invent while fighting with stubborn kid leather. The process could be surprisingly perilous. Overstretching weakened the glove's seams, leading to a dramatic split mid-handshake. Understretching meant you'd spend the evening with numb fingertips, forced to smile politely while your hands slowly turned the colour of overripe plums. There were even anecdotes of people getting halfway into a glove and realising they were stuck, requiring a friend, spouse, or mortified footman to help peel it off. Naturally, manufacturers seized on the opportunity to make glove stretchers into status symbols. Basic models were plain wood, but the fashionable elite could purchase ones carved from ivory, inlaid with mother of pearl, or fitted with silver handles engraved with monograms. A well-appointed dressing table might have several sizes, because nothing said I'm wealthy quite like owning a dedicated stretching device for every style of glove you owned. Men, too, had their struggles. While ladies' gloves were often decorative, men's were more utilitarian, worn for riding, fencing, or formal occasions. But even a gentleman could be judged by the limpness of his handshake, or the fit of his leather. A wrinkled, sagging glove suggested carelessness. A perfectly fitted one implied discipline, taste, and perhaps just a touch of vanity. There were occasional improvements to the design. Some stretchers included tiny heating elements to soften stiff leather before widening it, a process that risked either perfect suppleness or an unpleasant smell of scorched cowhide. Others claimed to have adjustable tension settings for precision stretching, although the difference between snug and ruined could be a matter of millimeters. By the early 20th century, as glove wearing declined and looser fits became more acceptable, the glove stretcher slipped quietly into the realm of quaint household relics. Today, you're more likely to find one in an antique shop than on a dressing table. Its purpose a mystery to anyone under the age of 70. Still, it's a perfect symbol of Victorian priorities. Comfort was negotiable, but appearances were not. So, the next time you slide on a pair of stretchy winter gloves without a second thought, take a moment to appreciate your freedom from scissor-like contraptions and pre-party leather wrestling matches. The Victorians may have had elegance, but it often came with a side of unnecessary hand trauma. Nothing says we have too much money like a custom umbrella for your horse. Now Dobbin can stay dry on your daily jaunt through the fog, and you can feel superior to peasants with damp ponies. Victorians adored their horses. Before cars, bicycles, or the invention of deciding to simply stay home when it rained, your horse was your primary mode of transportation, and often a direct reflection of your social status. A well-groomed, glossy-coated stallion or mare told the world that you were refined, wealthy, and had someone else to shovel unpleasant things out of your stables. Naturally, if you cared about appearances, and every Victorian did, you couldn't have your beloved steed showing up to the park looking like it had been dunked in the Thames. Enter the horsey rain shield, a device that can only be described as a cross between an oversized parasol and a questionable life choice. Mounted via a leather harness or metal frame, the umbrella arched gracefully over the horse's head and back, keeping rain and some degree of bird-related hazards off its fine coat. In theory, it was a stroke of genius. In practice, it depended heavily on how cooperative your horse felt that day. The wealthy set in London and other cities embraced the idea for a while, especially those with delicate breeds whose coats took hours to brush into a show-ready sheen. Why waste all that grooming just for a sudden drizzle to flatten the mane? The umbrella also supposedly made riding more pleasant for the human, since a dry horse was a less irritable horse. And perhaps, though no one would admit it, there was a bit of competitive flair involved. After all, what better way to one-up your neighbours than by arriving at the park with a horse dressed for the weather like a Victorian aristocrat's pet project? Still, there were issues. Horses, famously, are not known for loving sudden noises or unexpected movements above their heads. A gust of wind could turn the rain shield into a large flapping monster, sending even the calmest gelding into a trot worthy of a military charge. More than one carriage ride ended abruptly when Dobbin decided that no amount of social superiority was worth being chased by an airborne parasol. Designers attempted to refine the invention. Some models were collapsible, so they could be neatly folded away when not in use, although folding an umbrella while still on horseback was a circus act in itself. Others used rigid waterproof panels rather than cloth to prevent sagging under heavy rain. The most expensive versions came in silk or oilskin, trimmed with tassels or lace to match the rider's own attire, because of course, if your horse had an umbrella, it had to be fashionable. There were even specialised horsey rain shields for different activities. Smaller, more aerodynamic versions existed for fox hunting, while larger, more decorative ones were designed for slow promenade rides through Hyde Park. Some wealthy owners commissioned matching rain gear for themselves and their horses, creating an unintentionally comedic sight: a perfectly dry, umbrella-topped horse next to a rider, looking like they'd just stepped out of the same tailor's shop. Despite the novelty, the practical drawbacks eventually outweighed the charm. The shields were heavy, cumbersome, and difficult to attach securely without interfering with reins or saddle, and in truly foul weather they provided only partial protection, leaving the horse's legs and underside drenched, leading critics to point out that the contraptions worked about as well as wearing a raincoat with no sleeves. By the turn of the 20th century, the horsey rain shield faded into obscurity, much like the horse as a primary means of urban transport. Today, surviving examples are mostly seen in museums, their absurdity appreciated in hindsight. They stand as reminders of a time when Victorian ingenuity, wealth, and vanity intersected in the most peculiar ways. So the next time you're caught in the rain without an umbrella, just be grateful you're not trying to wrestle one onto a 1,200-pound animal while maintaining your dignity and your saddle. Why pay for human servants when you can have a clockwork man serve your tea, or at least spill it everywhere? Winding him up took less time than apologizing for the mess. In the late Victorian era, the fascination with automata, mechanical figures designed to imitate human actions, was at its height. Wealthy households, ever eager to show off the latest marvels of engineering, were quick to embrace the idea of replacing at least part of their domestic staff with something more predictable. Well, in theory, the clockwork servant promised to bring tea, pour drinks, or deliver small trays of biscuits, all without asking for wages, days off, or an extra lump of sugar in their own cup. The concept was simple. A life-sized or sometimes half-sized humanoid figure, dressed in livery, with internal gears, springs, and cams that translated mechanical motion into eerily human gestures. You wound it up with a large brass key, often hidden in the back of its jacket, and once released, the servant would trundle forward, carefully balancing a tray. If all went well, it would stop precisely in front of your guest, bow stiffly, and present the refreshments with mechanical dignity. If all did not go well, the result might be tea in someone's lap and a biscuit skidding across the carpet. Despite the mishaps, these devices became status symbols. They represented not only cutting-edge engineering but also the host's ability to purchase whimsy for the sake of whimsy. Guests might gasp at the sight of a clockwork butler wheeling towards them, its glass eyes fixed in polite indifference, while the host explained its mechanism in loving detail. The more lifelike the movements, the greater the bragging rights, although too much realism could tip the whole affair into unsettling territory. There's something deeply unnerving about being stared down by a wooden-faced man in a waistcoat who doesn't blink. Practicality, of course, was not the main selling point. Unlike human servants, clockwork ones couldn't adapt when a teacup tipped dangerously or when a guest moved out of position. Their movements were preset, meaning any obstacle, be it a misplaced chair leg or a particularly stubborn pug, could bring the performance to an abrupt halt. Resetting them required unwinding, repositioning, and occasionally emergency repairs with a screwdriver and a strong drink. Some owners grew fond of their mechanical staff, naming them as if they were real employees. There are accounts of Jeeves or Alfred being dressed in seasonally appropriate outfits, complete with miniature aprons or Santa hats during the holidays. Others treated them as conversation pieces, trotting them out only for formal dinners or special gatherings lest overuse wear down their delicate parts. And wear down they did. Clockwork mechanisms, especially those carrying a tray laden with china and liquids, were under constant strain. Gears could strip, springs could snap, and misalignments could cause a servant to veer off course entirely, marching resolutely toward a wall while the tea sloshed ominously. Maintaining one required either an on-call clockmaker or a willingness to tinker yourself, leading to many stories of frustrated owners dismantling their expensive purchase on the dining table while guests looked on. The clockwork servant never became truly common, partly because of the expense, and partly because, despite their mechanical charm, they could never fully replace human adaptability. Still, they remained an enduring curiosity, a glimpse into the Victorian belief that technology could solve even the most trivial inconveniences. They were the original smart home device, the Alexa or Roomba of their day, albeit one powered by springs instead of software. Today, surviving examples fetch astonishing sums at auction, often bought by collectors of automata or displayed in museums. Watching one in action now is both delightful and slightly absurd. The stiff bow, the careful shuffle, the inevitable rattle of its internal parts. You can't help but admire the craftsmanship, even as you imagine the anxiety of trusting it with a full teapot. So the next time you tap your phone to summon a delivery, or tell a smart speaker to dim the lights, remember the Victorians who dreamed of a future where even the pouring of tea could be outsourced to a polite, whirring figure in a velvet jacket, just as long as you didn't mind mopping up afterward. Teenagers getting ideas? The Anti-snog device, a metal face mask, kept young couples at a safe chaperone distance. Because nothing says love like cold steel between you and your date. The Victorian era was obsessed with propriety, and nowhere was this more apparent than in its approach to romance. Courtship was a slow, carefully choreographed dance of polite conversation, supervised walks, and exchanges of handwritten notes that took longer to deliver than it takes us now to get divorced. Physical affection before marriage was heavily frowned upon, at least in respectable circles, and if a young couple was caught holding hands without gloves, there might be whispers, fan flutters, and possibly an urgent letter to a clergyman. Enter the anti-snog device, a contraption that took the idea of chaste romance to its most literal and absurd extreme. Imagine a thin metal framework shaped to fit over the lower face, with bars or a mesh grill covering the mouth and chin. The idea was simple. If you can't get your lips past a cold iron barrier, you can't commit any acts of scandal. The device could be strapped in place with leather buckles or tied with ribbons, depending on how festive your parents wanted your humiliation to look. These masks were sometimes used in boarding schools or highly conservative households, particularly during dances or social events where hormones were considered especially dangerous. A chaperone could simply present each young gentleman or lady with their romance guard for the evening, ensuring no one could accidentally fall into sin or even sneeze comfortably. The official reasoning was, of course, moral protection. But the practicalities left something to be desired. Speaking was muffled, eating was nearly impossible, and drinking required either a straw or the removal of the device altogether, something that inevitably attracted suspicion. Worst of all, they were deeply unflattering, turning every tender smile into something that looked like a prisoner's mugshot. Naturally, this only made them more hilarious to those forced to wear them. Teenagers, then as now, had a talent for turning restrictive rules into games. Some treated the anti-snog mask as a badge of rebellious honor, decorating it with small charms or etching rude messages into the metal. Others used it as a challenge, seeing how close they could lean toward one another without making contact. A Victorian version of the almost kiss seen in modern teen dramas. Parents, meanwhile, took the device very seriously. In a time when an unsanctioned kiss could lead to gossip, scandal, or even a hasty marriage, the mask was seen as a small investment in the family's social stability. It was far easier to strap a contraption to your child's face than to risk an unplanned elopement. There are scattered accounts of more elaborate versions, with small locks to prevent removal without a key. A key held, naturally, by the chaperone. Imagine trying to impress your date while their mother literally holds the means to your physical freedom in her handbag. Romantic, it was not. Like many overzealous inventions, the anti-snog device eventually fell out of fashion, partly because it was ridiculous, and partly because it was deeply impractical. As social norms loosened and supervised courtship became less rigid, by the early 20th century, it was largely relegated to curiosity shops and the occasional morality exhibit. Today, seeing one in a museum produces the same mix of amusement and disbelief that many Victorian inventions do. It's hard not to laugh at the earnestness with which people tried to mechanize morality, as though human desire could be kept in check by a few inches of brass. So the next time you're awkwardly leaning in for a first kiss and worrying about bad timing or bad breath, just remember, it could be worse. You could be trying to flirt through a miniature metal fence while your date's mother jingles the key. Tired of switching utensils? Try the combined fork and knife, a device that only makes sense if you've never eaten anything more complex than boiled carrots. The Victorian dining table was a battlefield of etiquette. Every movement, from the angle of your wrist while cutting to the way you dabbed your lips, was loaded with social meaning. For some, the constant switching between fork and knife was an unnecessary waste of time and elegance. Why break your conversational flow just to change utensils? Why not simply merge them into one streamlined, all-purpose eating weapon? Thus was born the combined fork and knife, a curious hybrid that promised to revolutionize mealtimes while quietly confusing anyone who tried to use it. Imagine a standard fork, its tines polished and prim, but with one edge sharpened like a knife. In theory, you could spear your food and then, with a subtle tilt of the wrist, saw through it without putting the fork down. In practice, the results depended heavily on both your skill and the temperament of your dinner companions. The slightest misjudgment could send peas scattering across the table or turn a slice of roast into a projectile aimed at the vicar. The device had its champions, mostly gadget enthusiasts and those who liked to boast of their efficiency, but it also had its detractors. Traditionalists considered it gauche, an affront to the delicate choreography of proper dining. After all, the fork and knife dance wasn't just about eating, it was about signalling refinement. Using one tool for both jobs was like wearing your evening coat over your pajamas. Technically functional but socially suspect, manufacturers tried to sell the combined utensil as modern and forward-thinking. Advertisements promised grace and convenience in every bite, showing illustrations of smiling couples enjoying a meal with just one piece of cutlery between them. Some models were even collapsible, with a hinge in the middle so you could fold it up and carry it in your pocket. Perfect. Apparently, for those moments when you might be unexpectedly invited to a picnic and didn't trust the host's silverware. But the reality was often less graceful. The knife edge on many models was either too dull to cut anything firmer than a soft potato, or too sharp, making the whole process faintly hazardous. There were whispered horror stories of diners nicking their lips while trying to eat in haste, or accidentally shredding their napkin while attempting to rest the utensil politely between bites. Some Victorians did find clever uses for it. Travellers appreciated the compact design when dining on trains, where juggling multiple utensils could be awkward. Soldiers and explorers also adopted sturdier versions, finding them handy when eating in less than civilized conditions. In these contexts, the combined fork and knife made perfect sense. It was just the drawing room where it seemed absurd. Like many innovations, its popularity was brief. By the early 20th century, as dining rituals loosened and mass-produced cutlery became cheaper, there was no real need to combine tools. The fork and knife each had their established place, and the awkward hybrid became a curiosity, often relegated to novelty gift status or left to gather dust in kitchen drawers. Today, surviving examples turn up in antique shops and collectors' cabinets, often mistaken for some kind of surgical instrument. They serve as a reminder that Victorians, for all their obsession with etiquette, were not immune to the occasional leap toward questionable convenience. So the next time you sit down to a proper meal, consider the combined fork and knife, a utensil that tried to make life simpler and instead gave the upper classes something new to argue about. And be grateful that when you cut your roast beef, you don't also have to worry about accidentally stabbing it straight into your own lap. You want a boiled egg? Why not use a small coal-powered machine that makes breakfast both dangerous and undercooked? The Victorian kitchen, not OSHA approved. Victorians had a peculiar talent for taking the simplest of tasks and turning them into mechanical spectacles. Making tea? Let's use a water heater with enough exposed brass pipes to scald a small village. Toasting bread? Surely that requires a rotating spit and an attentive servant. So naturally, boiling an egg, already one of the easiest culinary achievements known to humanity, was ripe for improvement via unnecessary engineering. Enter the mechanical egg boiler, a countertop contraption built from polished brass, rivets, and the faint hope that no one would lose an eyebrow in the process. Often coal or spirit heated, these machines were designed to hold 1 to 6 eggs in small wire baskets, which were then lowered into a boiling water chamber. The clever part, supposedly, was that the device would time the cooking for you, although clever is a generous term when the result was as unpredictable as a Victorian séance. Operating the thing was a ritual in itself. First, you filled the reservoir with water. Careful not to splash any on the heating element unless you fancied turning your breakfast into a miniature steam explosion. Then you added coal or alcohol to the burner, lit it, and waited for the water to reach the optimal temperature. This could take anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes depending on the weather, the coal quality, and whether the machine's valves felt like cooperating that morning. Once boiling, you placed your eggs in their little cradles and lowered them into the water chamber with a delicate lever. Some models had timers that rang a small bell when the eggs were done. Others had a more ominous hiss and clunk mechanism that made the whole process sound like a railway engine pulling into the station. Either way, the timing was rarely perfect. Soft-boiled eggs could emerge still raw in the middle, while hard-boiled ones sometimes developed a texture reminiscent of chalk. The marketing pitch was, of course, irresistible to the gadget-loving Victorian. Ads boasted that the mechanical egg boiler freed you from the guesswork of breakfast preparation. "Never again will your eggs be ruined," promised one particularly optimistic pamphlet, glossing over the fact that the machine's complex assembly required more cleaning than an entire scullery's worth of crockery. These devices also doubled as status symbols. The more ornate models were decorated with engraved scrollwork, porcelain handles, and even small figurines perched atop the water reservoir. Some were built into elaborate breakfast sets alongside toast racks, butter dishes, and tea warmers, creating the impression that one's morning meal required as much infrastructure as a minor railway station. Naturally, there were hazards. A careless bump could tip the whole contraption, spilling boiling water across the table and onto the nearest unlucky diner. Coal sparks occasionally leapt from the burner, making breakfast both a meal and a fire drill. And since ventilation in Victorian kitchens was often limited, using a coal-heated egg boiler could turn the room into a warm, smoky haze before you'd even cracked a yolk. Despite the risks, the mechanical egg boiler held on for decades, beloved by those who considered cooking an egg with a simple saucepan far too plebeian. But as gas and electric stoves became common, the appeal of a temperamental, soot-belching breakfast machine waned. By the early 20th century, most had been retired to attics. Their brass dulled and their levers rusted into stillness. Today, surviving examples are prized by collectors, not for their culinary excellence, but for their sheer commitment to over-engineering the mundane. Watching one in action now is equal parts charming and absurd, a miniature steam engine dedicated to the noble, if slightly underwhelming, task of making your morning egg. So the next time you set a pot of water to boil and wait a neat 6 minutes, remember the Victorians who believed breakfast should be equal parts nourishment, performance art, and potential workplace hazard. Have too many books? The reading wheel let you display multiple open volumes at once, like a rotary phone for novels, a dream come true for multitaskers, or anyone who enjoys spinning out of control. The Victorians loved their books. This was the golden age of serial novels, moral instruction manuals, and encyclopedias so heavy you could use them as emergency doorstops. For the truly dedicated reader, or at least the wealthy one, reading a single book at a time simply wasn't enough. Why settle for one narrative when you could have an entire library's worth of open pages ready at your fingertips? Thus emerged the reading wheel, a magnificent contraption that combined the grandeur of a globe stand with the fidgety energy of a spinning game show wheel. Picture a large, upright wooden frame with a central rotating drum, its rim lined with angled shelves. Each shelf could hold an open book, held in place by gentle clamps or weighted cords so the pages didn't flutter shut. A reader could spin the wheel to switch from Dickens to a French grammar guide to an atlas, all without leaving their chair. It was the Victorian equivalent of having 20 browser tabs open at once, except instead of a quick click, you gave the entire mechanism a satisfying shove and hoped it stopped where you wanted. The reading wheel appealed to more than just novelty seekers. Scholars and researchers found it invaluable for cross-referencing multiple works without scattering them across a table. Imagine working on a paper about Roman history with Gibbon's Decline and Fall on one shelf, a Latin dictionary on another, and a volume of classical poetry perched just above eye level, all arranged so you could pivot between them, like a conductor turning to cue the violins. But the reading wheel was not without its quirks. For one, it was big. Even the smaller models took up a good corner of a study, while the grander versions looked like they belonged in an observatory, ready to chart the constellations. And spinning the wheel too enthusiastically could send your carefully balanced books sliding out like a literary landslide. A particularly forceful turn might even smack an inattentive cat or topple a precariously placed teacup. There was also the matter of coordination. Because the books were mounted at varying heights and angles, you had to adjust your reading position constantly, leaning forward to squint at the top shelf, craning your neck down to catch a footnote on the lower one. Long reading sessions could leave you with both literary enlightenment and an urgent appointment with the family osteopath. Victorian craftsmen, of course, spared no opportunity to turn the reading wheel into a status symbol. Some were made of rich mahogany with brass fittings, polished so finely you could see your reflection in the spokes. Others had intricate carvings, ivy vines, floral motifs, or even the occasional cherub, reminding visitors that you weren't just well-read. You were also the sort of person who could afford to commission an unnecessarily ornate piece of furniture for the sole purpose of holding open books. For the obsessive reader, the wheel was intoxicating. You could start the morning with a scientific treatise, roll into an afternoon of romantic poetry, and finish the evening with a scandalous serialized novel, all without once stacking your reading material in untidy piles. It was multitasking, taken to a refined, slightly absurd extreme. Inevitably, the reading wheel faded from fashion. Smaller desks, cheaper books, and the rise of more portable reading habits made it seem excessive. By the early 20th century, most surviving wheels gathered dust in the corners of private libraries, or were sold off to eccentric collectors who liked the idea of spinning through their literature like a Victorian roulette player. Today, the reading wheel survives mostly in museums, and the dreams of bibliophiles who wish they had both the space and the budget for such an indulgence. But its spirit lives on every time we sit with a stack of books beside us, flipping between them in a restless search for the next perfect paragraph. So the next time you catch yourself with 3 novels on the sofa, 2 open tabs on your e-reader, and an audiobook playing in the background, take comfort. You're simply honouring the legacy of the Victorians, who believed that reading should always be immersive, inefficient, and just a little bit theatrical. Afraid of being buried alive? You're not alone. The safety coffin came with bells, flags, and even breathing tubes so you could let people know if you woke up 6 feet under. Victorian optimism at its weirdest. In the 19th century, death was an all-too-frequent visitor. Epidemics, accidents, and mysterious fevers could carry off the healthiest person in days or hours. But nothing terrified Victorians quite like the idea of not actually being dead when declared so. This wasn't just a Gothic novelist's obsession, it was a genuine fear, fueled by occasional, and usually exaggerated, newspaper stories of people discovered to be very much alive after being laid to rest. Medical science, still in its enthusiastic but wrong adolescence, wasn't always great at distinguishing deep coma from actual death. And in an era when wakes weren't always lengthy enough to be sure, people with lively imaginations started thinking, what if I go under, wake up in the dark, and realize I've been buried? That's when inventive minds, always ready to monetize anxiety, stepped in with the safety coffin. Designs varied, but the central idea was the same. Build in a way for the buried corpse to signal the living world that they were not, in fact, a corpse. The most famous models featured a bell mounted on a pole above the grave, attached to a string or wire that ran down into the coffin and tied to the occupant's hand. If the sleeper awoke to find themselves boxed in, they could ring frantically until someone came to investigate. Other designs were more elaborate. Some had flags that could be raised by pulling a lever inside the coffin. A few came with ventilation tubes to allow fresh air to circulate, a feature that, while thoughtful, also doubled as an expressway for insects to join you in your underground panic. The truly deluxe models even had small speaking tubes, so you could shout your predicament directly at whoever was unfortunate enough to be passing by the graveyard. Of course, the practicality of these devices was questionable. Bells might ring on their own thanks to shifting soil or animals brushing against the grave marker, leading to frantic midnight digging parties, only to find a perfectly still, perfectly dead body. Conversely, in the event of an actual premature burial, rescuers might be too far away, or too slow, to make a happy ending possible. But Victorians were nothing if not thorough. Some insurance companies even offered premature burial clauses, allowing policyholders to specify that their burial include a safety coffin. Pamphlets of the time reassured buyers that with the right contraption, no man need fear the grave. This was optimistic to the point of comedy, considering the era's other hazards, like open sewers and smallpox. In practice, there's little evidence that anyone was ever saved by a safety coffin. It's far more likely that the entire industry was driven by a potent mix of morbid fascination, urban legend, and the Victorian love for mechanical solutions to existential problems. Still, They were popular enough that some cemeteries kept watchmen on duty, men tasked with keeping an eye and ear out for unexpected graveside activity. The safety coffin's legacy lives on in pop culture, where it's often portrayed as a quaintly creepy relic of overcautious times. But in truth, it's a perfect example of Victorian thinking. If you can't eliminate the risk, at least invent something complicated and slightly ridiculous to manage it. Today, safety coffins are museum oddities, fascinating for their combination of engineering, superstition, and straight-faced absurdity. And while our modern fears lean more towards spam calls and bad Wi-Fi than premature burial, the impulse behind them, the human refusal to go quietly, remains oddly relatable. So, if you ever find yourself lying awake at night, contemplating your own mortality, just remember, the Victorians were there first, and they dealt with it by installing a panic button in the afterlife. And finally, for the adventurous soul, the balloon parachute. Test pilots jumped off buildings with a parachute shaped like a hot air balloon. The invention worked, provided you didn't value your ankles or your dignity. The Victorian era was a golden age of invention, especially if you define golden as full of contraptions designed to prove Darwin right. If there was a way to take an activity that had been quietly safe for centuries and make it considerably more dangerous, the Victorians were all in. This applied to personal transportation, home appliances, and apparently, the act of not dying when falling from a height. Enter the balloon parachute, a gravity-defying idea that was equal parts physics experiment, public spectacle, and very slow emergency. The basic concept was simple enough, at least on paper. Imagine a large silk parachute, shaped more like an upside-down hot air balloon than the flat canopies we know today. The wide, rounded top was meant to trap air and slow descent, while the user dangled underneath in a simple harness or occasionally just clung to a wooden frame. Unlike modern parachutes, which were tested under controlled conditions and by people who had signed several terrifying waivers, the Victorian version was often trialled by enthusiastic amateurs who had, at best, a basic understanding of wind resistance and, at worst, just a very strong sense of optimism. Demonstrations were the main selling point. Crowds would gather in public squares, gardens, and even theatre courtyards to watch a brave, or possibly desperate, soul leap from the roof of a building or a tall scaffold. The launch was slow and deliberate. The jumper would be helped into the harness. The balloon-shaped canopy would be carefully arranged, and then, with much cheering, they would step off the edge into history, or at least into the local news. In ideal conditions, the balloon parachute did work, sort of. The descent was gentler than a straight fall, and in some cases the user would land without major injury, just a few bruises and the newfound conviction that staying on the ground was vastly underrated. But wind was a fickle ally. A sudden gust could spin the parachute sideways, slam the jumper into a wall, or collapse the canopy entirely, and unlike with modern skydiving, there was no reserve chute, only the faint hope that the crowd would break your fall. Then there was the problem of landing. The balloon parachute slowed your vertical speed, but not enough to make touching down pleasant. Many users describe the final moments as dropping into a chair from a great height, a poetic way of saying your knees and ankles took the brunt of the experience. If you were lucky, you'd limp away to applause. If you weren't, you'd be carried away to the nearest surgeon, who would then lecture you about the importance of using your legs for walking, not plummeting. Despite the hazards, inventors doubled down, producing new models with heavier frames, larger silk canopies, and elaborate folding mechanisms. Some designs looked more like collapsible tents, others like umbrellas that had been bullied by the wind. There was even the occasional two-person version, which sounds romantic until you imagine sharing a badly controlled fall with someone you were hoping to impress. Part of the balloon parachute's appeal was its theatricality. This was the age of spectacle. Tightrope walkers, fire eaters, human cannonballs, and a parachute jump fit perfectly into the menu of public entertainment. Newspapers breathlessly reported each successful, or at least non-fatal leap, and engravings of parachutists drifting past church spires and over astonished crowds sold well as souvenirs. Yet, as with so many Victorian inventions, the balloon parachute was ultimately less a revolution in safety than an experiment in how much excitement people would pay to watch. By the early 20th century, as aviation advanced and parachutes became more practical tools for pilots, The hot air balloon-shaped oddity was retired to history's more whimsical pages. Surviving examples now sit in museums, looking like props from a children's storybook, their silk faded but their sense of absurdity intact. Today, it's hard not to admire the audacity of the people who tested them, standing high above a crowd, trusting their lives to a device that looked like it belonged at a summer fair rather than in a survival manual. They may not have always landed gracefully, but they certainly made an impression, both on the audience and on the cobblestones below. Victorian winters were brutal, and nothing betrayed you faster than a freezing nose. That's why some clever soul invented the patented nose warmer, a tiny woolen pouch you strap over your nostrils looking like a Victorian walrus on holiday. Forget fashion. This was about survival, and also about giving everyone in your home something new to mock you for at breakfast. The Victorians took cold seriously. Homes were drafty, heating was minimal, and insulation was basically put on another layer and hope for the best. Faces, unfortunately, were hard to layer up without cutting off essential senses like sight and speech. But your nose, poor, protruding, frost-prone, was the first to betray you to winter's chill. Frozen noses weren't just uncomfortable. They could be painful, even dangerous in prolonged exposure. Enter the patented nose warmer, a tiny knitted or flannel contraption with the sole purpose of insulating your most prominent facial landmark. The design varied from model to model, but the classic was simple. A small padded pouch, often made from wool, velvet or flannel, shaped roughly like a miniature oven mitt. It was strapped in place with elastic, ribbons, or even delicate chains, depending on how fashionable or absurd the wearer wished to appear. Slip it on, and suddenly your nose was encased in a snug cocoon of warmth. Slip it off, and you'd be reminded how much worse the cold felt without it. Wearing one in public was a bold move. At home, you might get away with it. After all, everyone else was wrapped in layers of shawls, scarves, and fingerless gloves. But outdoors, strolling the high street with a woolen sack strapped to your face was bound to attract stares. Some Victorians didn't care. Others leaned into the ridiculousness, choosing bright colours, embroidered patterns, or even fur-trimmed models to turn their nasal apparel into a kind of seasonal statement piece. The nose warmer wasn't purely for walking about town, though. Many people wore them indoors, particularly in chilly bedrooms or during carriage rides. Imagine settling in for the night in a drafty Victorian home, your bed warmed by a hot water bottle and your head wrapped in a nightcap, but your nose still sticking out in frosty defiance. The nose warmer solved that problem neatly, if not elegantly. Of course, practicality often clashed with propriety. Victorian etiquette manuals made no mention of how to politely remove one before greeting a guest, and no one quite agreed on whether it was acceptable to keep it on at the breakfast table. A gentleman wearing one might look vaguely like a walrus mid-sneeze. A lady might appear as though she had accidentally strapped a tea cosy to her face. Children, naturally, found them hilarious and took every opportunity to yank them off their parents' faces for sport. Inventors tried to innovate. Some versions had tiny heating elements, small pouches filled with heated sand or metal discs warmed by the fire before being inserted. Others experimented with perfumes or menthol linings, turning the nose warmer into a kind of early aromatherapy device. There were even lace-trimmed varieties intended for the refined lady, which somehow managed to make the whole concept look even stranger. While the nose warmer enjoyed a small but loyal following, it never quite caught on with the masses. Scarves were more versatile, and for the truly desperate, simply staying indoors was preferable to becoming the neighbourhood's resident facial fashion pioneer. By the early 20th century, the nose warmer was largely a curiosity, turning up in humour columns as an example of Victorian eccentricity. Today, they survive mostly in museum displays or vintage clothing collections, where they are inevitably photographed and shared online to equal parts amusement and bafflement. And yet, if you've ever walked outside on a freezing morning and felt that first icy pinch on the tip of your nose, you can't help but think maybe they were onto something. So the next time winter bites, and you're tempted to double wrap your scarf up to your eyeballs, remember the Victorian nose warmer, a humble, slightly ridiculous invention that asked the eternal question, why suffer in silence when you can suffer in style? Victorian hairdos required more scaffolding than your average bridge. So at night, people protected their elaborate styles with a bird's nest protector. essentially a wire cage for your hair. Yes, you went to sleep looking like you'd lost a fight with a chicken coop, but at least you'd wake up with your curls unsmooshed and your self-esteem only moderately damaged. In the Victorian era, hair was more than hair. It was a billboard announcing your status, your patience, and the amount of hot curling iron burns you were willing to tolerate in a single sitting. Styles could involve towering arrangements of curls, braids, and ringlets, reinforced with pins, combs, and enough pomade to trap small insects. Getting one of these styles right could take hours. Naturally, the last thing you wanted was to destroy it by sleeping on it like a mere mortal. Enter the bird's nest hair protector. A circular or oval wire frame designed to encase your head while you slept. Some were delicate, made of thin metal rings with cross supports. Others were sturdy enough to survive a mild earthquake. The idea was simple. Your hair would hover inside the cage, untouched by pillows, blankets, or the restless tossing of the night. In theory, you'd wake up looking exactly as you had the evening before, ready to greet the day without a single curl out of place. Of course, in theory was doing a lot of work here. Sleeping in a bird's nest hair protector was an experience somewhere between wearing a medieval helmet and sticking your head inside a decorative lampshade. Side sleeping was nearly impossible, unless you enjoyed jabbing yourself in the shoulder with metal spokes. Rolling over in bed could produce a metallic clang loud enough to startle the household cat. And heaven help you if you shared a bed, your unfortunate partner might get an unexpected midnight poke in the eye. Still, for the fashion-conscious Victorian, the discomfort was worth it. Elaborate hairstyles were expensive, not just in salon fees, but in the time and energy needed to achieve them. A bird's nest protector could buy you a precious extra day or two before you had to endure another round of curling, teasing, and pinning. And in a world without dry shampoo, stretching the life of your hairstyle wasn't just vanity, it was survival. Naturally, Victorian inventors couldn't resist tinkering. Some protectors were lined with silk or satin to prevent snags. Others folded flat for travel, allowing you to carry your personal hair fortress to a friend's house or even on a long train journey. There were even versions with small built-in combs to gently refresh your style while you slept, though this was optimistic given the device's overall resemblance to a torture instrument. Not everyone was a fan. Satirical magazines mocked them as absurd contraptions for the overly vain, and husbands reportedly complained about cage head as a genuine nighttime hazard. Children, of course, found them endlessly entertaining, especially when they could slip the cage over their own heads and parade around, pretending to be fashionable society ladies or exotic zoo animals. By the early 20th century, as hairstyles shifted towards simpler, shorter cuts, the bird's nest hair protector quietly disappeared from bedrooms. But it never entirely vanished from cultural memory. Today, surviving examples can be found in museums, their strange shapes sitting somewhere between hat stands and medieval armour. They're often displayed alongside other baffling Victorian beauty tools, each one a reminder that the quest for perfect hair has always been a little bit ridiculous. So the next time you wake up with bedhead and mutter something unkind at your reflection, remember the Victorians who went to sleep inside a wire cage every night. Sure, they avoided pillow flattening, but they also risked mild concussion just by turning over. And that, really, is dedication at its most impractical. Tired of carrying an umbrella in the ceaseless British drizzle? Just strap it to your head. The umbrella hat promised dryness and hands-free convenience, at the low, low price of looking like a wind-blown teapot. It kept your head dry and your reputation damp. The British Isles are famous for two things: tea and unpredictable weather. One moment you're strolling along in weak sunlight, the next you're being pelted with sideways rain that somehow manages to hit you directly in the ear. The Victorian umbrella was already a prized possession, but it came with a fatal flaw. It required at least one hand to operate. And Victorians, being Victorians, were always holding something. A walking stick, a cup of tea, a letter of introduction, or possibly a large and poorly socialized dog. Enter the umbrella hat. Its premise was absurdly simple. Take a standard umbrella, shrink it down, and mount it on a headband or chin strap so you could wear it like a hat. This freed up your hands entirely for more important things, like gesturing dramatically or wrestling with your parcels on a windy day. Of course, the reality was less dignified. While an umbrella hat could indeed shield your head from rain, it didn't do much for the rest of your body. Your shoulders, chest, and knees would still get soaked, leaving you looking like you'd been caught halfway through a failed magic trick. Worse, the head-mounted design meant that any gust of wind turned the whole thing into a personal weather vane. One moment, you'd be walking forward. The next, your umbrella hat would spin like a carnival ride, yanking your head to one side. And then there was the problem of appearance. Even in an era famous for elaborate headgear, feathered bonnets, towering hats, turbans, the umbrella hat was a step too far. Imagine meeting a friend for lunch and arriving with a small flapping awning mounted to your skull. You might keep the rain off your hair, but you'd never keep the smirk off their face. The Victorians, however, were not easily discouraged by practicality or public mockery. Designs varied wildly. Some models were collapsible, folding down neatly when not in use. Though neatly is relative, when you're talking about fabric, metal spokes, and a head strap. Others were festooned with frills or lace to make them more fashionable, which mostly succeeded in making them look like parasols that had escaped from a dollhouse. There were even dual-purpose versions with a reflective lining on top, marketed as sun hats for summer, because nothing says I'm enjoying the seaside like wearing a hovering disc of tinfoil above your head. It wasn't just a civilian fad, either. Umbrella hats occasionally found use among street vendors, who appreciated being able to stand in the rain with both hands free to make change or ladle soup. Fishermen were also said to favour them, though whether that's true or just a cruel stereotype about British fishing culture is up for debate. Naturally, the satirical press had a field day. Cartoons depicted hapless umbrella hat wearers being lifted off their feet in strong winds or knocking over passers-by in crowded streets. One Punch magazine illustration showed an entire dinner party wearing them indoors, as if preparing for a particularly aggressive leak in the ceiling. Despite the ridicule, the umbrella hat never truly died. It simply shifted from earnest invention to novelty gag. Modern versions, brightly coloured, often with comically tiny canopies, are still sold at seaside towns, music festivals and tourist shops, where they're worn, ironically, by people who underestimate how much they'll appreciate them after an hour of drizzle. So yes, the umbrella hat might have been a Victorian absurdity, but it was an absurdity with purpose. It kept you dry enough to avoid pneumonia, freed your hands for the important work of being British, and ensured that if the weather didn't get you, the judgmental stares certainly would. So tonight, as you settle into your clean, memory foam mattress, without springs launching you across the room, without leeches, mechanical egg boilers, or the threat of being woken by a mustache-related emergency, maybe send a quiet thank you to the inventors who failed so we could all win. Victorians suffered through more than just coal dust and boiled cabbage. They risked electrocution for a smaller waist, embarrassment for a dry nose, and public ridicule for a hands-free umbrella. Because history isn't just a story of progress. It's a parade of weird ideas, hopeful experiments, and people so stubbornly inventive that even the silliest gadget was worth a try. They built contraptions for every inconvenience, sometimes just to avoid social awkwardness, sometimes out of pure unfiltered boredom, and sometimes because nobody had invented Netflix yet. So, as you drift off tonight, maybe feel a little grateful for central heating, modern medicine, and the fact that your bathtub doesn't have to be folded up and wheeled through a train station. Remember, humanity is resilient, endlessly creative, and, let's be honest, a little bit ridiculous. Thank you for joining me on this odd journey through the strangest corners of the Victorian mind. Sleep well, and may your dreams be free of alarm beds, cat pianos, and umbrella hats. Good night.